Hi there. Welcome to this online session for music performance. I'm Chris, the music performance teacher, and today I'm going to be delivering a lesson on some music history and looking at some of the more famous artists within the genre of rock and roll. Okay, to start off with, you'll need a pen and paper to participate today. And you'll be asked to pause the video at certain times and to work on certain tasks. So if you need to do that now, if you just want to pause the video and make sure you've got a pen and paper handy, we will begin. Okay, so today's lesson is on the 27 Club and all the unfortunate artists that make up that club. We'll be talking about who they are and what that means in a second. Now, this makes up part of the unit known as Pop in Practice. So let's have a little bit of a look at the grading criteria there. So this is an actual assignment that you will be asked to complete on the music course. So everything that we do today can be used and will be put towards giving you a final mark. So you've got 4 things in this unit that it asks you to do. The first 2 are a written exercise and the second 2 are a practical exercise. Okay, so to sum them up, as we go through each decade from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s and noughties, we'll be looking at different types of music, different artists from each decade. And then at the end, you've got to put together an assignment that shows all the different things you've learned, not only about the music, but the history of the music as well, and how it was that it came to be. Outcomes 3 and 4 are the practical elements to this unit. And this is where you actually get to perform the music that you're learning about. So if we're learning about 50s rock and roll, you're going to have to play an Elvis song. If we're learning about 90s grunge, you would have to play potentially a Nirvana song. Okay, and that's quite similar for most of the units on the music course. There's a written element and a practical element as well. Let's dive into today then. We are going to be talking about something called the 27 Club. Now, before we even get into what that means, I would like you to just have a good look at the picture. If you can, and you can pause the video to do this, I'd like to have a go at naming each person that's on the screen. Now, you can ask anyone who's there with you, mums, dads, brothers or sisters. You might know a couple. I'd be really impressed if you knew 1 or 2. But if you don't know any, don't worry, because you will do by the end of the lesson. So if you'd like to pause the video now, name as many of those people on the screen as possible for me. Okay, assuming you've named as many as you can, then let's dive in and talk about what the 27 Club actually is, and then we'll see if you could recognize any of the musicians. So the 27 Club is a collection of musicians that very tragically passed away at the age of 27. Now, this is what we call a cultural phenomenon. There's no evidence to suggest that the age of 27 is cursed, or there's any really scientific reason as to why it happened, but it does seem to be a rather big coincidence that so many iconic stars were taken from us at such a young age. There's also the theory that actually they're more iconic because they were taken so young at that age. Their legacy lives on because they're no longer with us. So looking at the picture, then let's go through one at a time, and we'll talk about each one a little bit in detail, and then we're going to focus specifically on one of the musicians today. Starting on the left, we have Janis Joplin. Now, Janis was a singer in the 1960s, part of the hippie psychedelic movement. She famously performed at Woodstock in 1969. We'll do a little bit more on Woodstock later, but to be honest, that's a whole lesson in itself, Woodstock. There really is so much to it. It's one of the biggest and most famous or infamous, if you like, music festivals of all time. So Janis was there. Janis actually cancelled her wedding to play at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967. So that's some dedication. She was the real deal. Now, if you haven't heard of Janis, don't worry, I would recommend going to Spotify or YouTube and looking these people up. But obviously, if you're on the course full time, we would be listening to them and going into a little bit more depth and hearing and kind of understanding what it was they were about. So Janis's band was Big Brother and the Holding Company. And some of their biggest hits were Me and Bobby McGee and Piece of My Heart, which you may know from a KFC advert. Moving then across the picture of the 27 Club, next to Janis we have Kurt Cobain. Now, Kurt Cobain was the frontman for the grunge band Nirvana. You can see him there. You can see he's left-handed playing his Fender Mustang there. He had several different guitars famously in his career, but the most famous is probably the Mustang. He did also play a Jaguar as well. Now, Kurt is not the only famous member of Nirvana. His drummer, Dave Grohl, went on to form the Foo Fighters, which you may have heard of. And their biggest hits are Heart-Shaped Box, Come As You Are, Smells Like Teen Spirit. Smells Like Teen Spirit was actually named after a deodorant. Next to Kurt Cobain, then, we have Jim Morrison. Jim is the lead singer for American rock band The Doors. He nicknamed himself the Lizard King, but it sort of caught on. And this was after a poem he wrote in which he exclaimed, "I am the Lizard King, I can do anything." So he's pretty far out 60s kind of hippie. Refers to himself as the Lizard King, but everyone else does. And found real commercial success, international fame with this band, The Doors. Now live, The Doors didn't have a bass player, but they achieved all the bass frequencies using a Fender Rhodes keyboard. Some of The Doors hits include Light My Fire, Break On Through to the Other Side, This Is the End. Now we're going to skip the gentleman in the middle because that's who we're going to focus on today. So if we miss one out, we move on to Amy Winehouse. Now there's a chance you may have recognised Amy because she was around in more your era, it's more than likely. So Amy was the first British female singer to win 5 Grammys. So it's a huge, huge achievement. Again, internationally famous, internationally renowned and critically acclaimed British artist. You can actually find a statue dedicated to Amy Winehouse in Camden Town and have your photo taken with that. Some of their biggest songs were Back to Black, Rehab and Valerie. Now Valerie, that she did with Mark Ronson, is actually a cover of the Zootons original. So a lot of people don't realise that and think that was an Amy Winehouse track, but it wasn't. But arguably, it was more successful than the original. And then the last one on the 27 Club picture was Brian Jones. Now he was one of the founding members of the Rolling Stones, and he was originally kind of the leader of the band before Mick Jagger. So a lot of people don't realise. You think of the Rolling Stones, you think Mick Jagger as the front man and kind of the band leader. But no, up until 1969, it was Brian Jones. Again, another one with an alter ego. It's not the Lizard King this time, but he referred to himself as Elmo Lewis, which is an homage, a dedication to a blues player called Elmore James, who he was obsessed with. And if you don't know any Rolling Stones hits, they include Painted Black, Sympathy for the Devil, You Can't Always Get What You Want, Satisfaction. Okay. So if you got some right, great. If you didn't know any of them, don't worry, because now you do. But we're going to focus now on the one in the middle, and that was Jimi Hendrix. So Jimi Hendrix, born Johnny Allen Hendrix in Seattle in 1942. He started playing guitar at the age of 15, but he had to hide this from his dad. So the USA is a deeply Christian nation, particularly at this time. And being left-handed was seen as a sign of the devil, or as a sign of corruption, if you like. So his dad didn't really take too kindly to it. So Jimmy strung his guitar the wrong way up, if you like, upside down, so he could play it. And then his dad would come in and kind of tell him off and turn it the right way up and try and force him to play right-handed. Now, it sounds awful, but potentially that's maybe why he got so good so quickly, because he could play it upside down, back to front as well. But really, he was a lefty and he was more comfortable with the guitar in his left hand. So at the age of 19, he signs up for 3 years in the army. Now, partly he can get away from his father and he can play as much guitar as he wants. He drove the men in his barracks crazy just by playing his guitar pretty much the entire time he was there. He decided the army wasn't for him, and he managed to maneuver an honourable discharge from the army. So that means they let him go. It was like a mutual agreement, which is really hard to come by in the army. Once they've got you enlisted, you know, they're not likely to let you go until your term is up. I won't go into the details of how he did that. That's something for you to look up if you are interested. But he managed to get out after just a year of being in the army. So Johnny Hendricks then moves to London. Now, this was where his career really started to kick off, and he achieved some international fame. So upon arriving in London, he changed his name to Jimmy. This was his manager's idea at the time. He thought Jimmy was way cooler. And obviously he was right, that caught on, and that's how we know him now. It's Jimi Hendrix. So prior to this, Jimmy's famous-ish. He's doing some session musician gigs in the USA. He's touring with various artists as the guitarist. But of course, if you've ever seen Hendrix play, you'll know he's not really kind of a background character. He wants to be the front man. So he clashed quite horribly with some really famous people, most notably Little Richard, the rock and roll artist. If you've ever seen Little Richard perform, he's very flamboyant, very much wants to be the centre of attention. So you can imagine him clashing with Jimi Hendrix as they compete for the spotlight. So he was almost a bit of a nomad, Hendrix. He went from band to band, never really fitting in, never really finding his niche. And it was time for him to go solo. And him and his people, his manager, figured London would be the place to do that. Now, although he was relatively unknown over here, he did make some pretty powerful or influential friends, most notably the girlfriends of the Rolling Stones. And they were able to show him around London, introduce him to the right people, and he managed to kickstart a solo career of his own. He moved into the apartment that was owned by composer Handel 250 years previously. Now that's still there in London in Carnaby Street, so you can still go there and see the apartment and visit it. It's a really, really historic place. Obviously it's had Handel living there and Jimi Hendrix. So Jimmy makes a huge splash in London, and that could be a whole lesson on itself, what the things he got up to in London, the gigs he did, and kind of the people he met. One of the more popular myths about Hendrix's time in London is that Jimmy is the reason that we have green parakeets in the UK. Apparently he went to a market, saw there were some green parakeets in a cage being sold as kind of an exotic pet, didn't like that and let them out. The rumour is that the parakeets actually bred, and now they're kind of native to this country as an invasive species. So if you ever see a green parrot, people like to believe that that was because of Jimi Hendrix. That myth's actually been disproved, and green parakeets were around before Hendrix came to London, but I do like it as a myth. So Hendrix has not been in London for very long, but he's already kind of turning heads and making waves. Jimmy's a huge fan of the British guitarist, Eric Clapton. Now, Eric Clapton's a big fan of the blues. Jimmy's a big fan of the blues. Clapton's famous. Therefore, part of the reason Jimmy was so keen to come to London was to meet Eric Clapton, his idol. But what actually happened was Hendrix ended up showing up Eric Clapton on stage and forcing Eric to walk, wait, not force him, but Eric walks off stage because Jimmy is so much better than him. So in the 60s, it's fairly commonplace for musicians to be able to get up and just jam, if you're good enough. If you can really play and you can convince the band and they know who you are, then yeah, come along and jam. You don't really get that so much now. So someone had vouched for Jimmy. Clapton's thinking, hey, this is my show. I'm probably the best guitarist in the world. I don't care who gets up and jams with me. Cool. So Jimmy gets up with his Strat. He bought his own guitar. He plugs into the other output on the bass player's amp, which I wouldn't recommend, but it will work if you're in a hurry. Plugs into the bass amp, and they launch into a Howlin' Wolf song. Now, the tempo that Jimmy set it at was almost double the speed at which it's played normally. So he's racing through it, lightning quick. At this point, I'd like you to pause the video, please. You'll see a link at the bottom. If we can click that link, we'll have a watch of the video And you can have a listen to the song that Hendrix played.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire,
Okay, so there's Howling Wolf playing the blues there, and that's exactly what Jimmy got up and played, but almost at twice the speed. So blues is something we would look at in depth in your first year at music college. It's basically 3 chords in the blues that you may or may not know. It's what we call a 1-4. We've got 7 chords in any key, and this one happens to be in the key of A. So our chord 1 is A. Then it goes to chord number 4. So we've got A, B, C sharp, D. Next to D we have E, so that's chord number 5. So those are the 3 chords that the music is going around. Okay, so not overly complex, but what was so impressive about what Hendrix did was not only the speed, but he was able to improvise over that and blow Eric Clapton out of the water using the kind of blues licks in a way that only Hendrix does. So it's got to be seriously fast and seriously good to cause Eric Clapton to walk off the stage, but that's what happened. Now later on, they became friends. There was no real bad blood, but it's something people remember. And Hendrix will always go down history as the guy who got made to leave the stage by Jimi Hendrix. Okay, so by this point, Hendrix is turning heads. He's making waves in the scene, and he's got everyone in England eating out the palm of his hand. This allows him to return to the States and play the kind of shows as a solo artist that he really wanted to play before. Now, unfortunately, by this point, Jimmy's heavily into drugs, mostly hallucinogens and psychedelic drugs, which made him very kind of susceptible to suggestion and persuasion. Suffice to say, he wasn't coherent a lot of the time, even while he was playing. So one day in New York City, he comes off stage and 2 men approach him, and they manage to get Jimmy out to their van quite willingly. They said, "We've got some drugs." He goes with them. And this is an occurrence that happens to him quite a lot, so he doesn't think anything of it. Now, it turns out the 2 men want to kidnap Jimmy, hold him for ransom, and try and extort money out of his management. So they drive him to an apartment building, they tie him to a chair, and then they phone up the club that Jimmy had just played and said, "Hey, we've got Jimi Hendrix here tied up. You got to give us some money." Now, what they failed to realise was the club owner had serious ties to the mob in New York, that is the mafia. So they didn't take too kindly to this, and the club owner was able to ring up the mob, get the address, and send some guys around there basically to get Jimmy back. Now, these 2 kidnappers were largely inexperienced. They didn't know what they were doing. No real harm came to Jimmy while he was there. He was kind of just hanging out in their their apartment, and they thought they were going to get paid. They thought it'd be as easy as that. But of course, the mob turns up at the door. Now, I won't go into detail about what happened, but Jimmy left to the sound of gunshots. So Jimmy is an international artist by this point. He is traveling all over the world with his band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. He's finally free as a solo artist to do what he wants. He can go to all these different countries to play his music. Now, when Jimmy arrives in Canada, the Mounties, the feds, the Canadian police are waiting for him. And they're going to do a drugs bust. They want to check everyone on the plane to make sure they're not bringing any illegal drugs into the country. So just like today, massively illegal, carries a huge penalty. You're looking at serious jail time if you get caught. Now, Hendrix and his band were tipped off about this just before getting to the airport. So they had time to get rid of anything on the plane that shouldn't be there. So they knew this was going to happen. But when they come to go through the police checkpoint and the police go through Jimmy's bag, they find 2 different illegal substances. And Jimmy says, I have no idea how they got there. Now, people are inclined to believe him, because why would he walk through a checkpoint, a drug stop, with something like that in his bag? So Jimmy's scheduled to play in Canada that evening. And he manages to get off on bail. It's a $10,000 bail, meaning his management have to pay $10,000, and Jimmy can go free until his hearing. So they set his hearing for 7 months down the line. Now, this massively affected Jimmy, even though he was free for the time being and he was allowed to go. If, when he went back to court, he was found guilty, he would have to spend 20 years in a Canadian prison. That would pretty much be the end of Jimi Hendrix. By the time he got out, it's going to be a different world. The scene's going to be over. He might not be relevant. He's going to be a different person. So it almost consumed Jimmy, the fear of this impending trial, and it played on his mind heavily, particularly kind of in his final year or so. However, while he was free, he was able to go and play Woodstock Festival. Now, Woodstock could be an entire course on itself, the things that went on and the planning, and it's something you might look at as well if you're doing the events course. But for now, we'll give you kind of a summary of Woodstock. So interestingly, it didn't actually take place in Woodstock. It took place in a place called Bethel, New York. It was scheduled to take place in Woodstock, which is kind of a small rural type village. But it was met with so much protest from the locals that the concert promoters were forced to move it. They said, we don't want this festival, we don't want these hippies coming into our town, our village, ruining it with a music festival. No way, it's not happening. So they managed to move it to Bethel, New York, and it went ahead almost as planned. You can see on your right there's a lineup, and you can see on the Sunday we've got Jimi Hendrix almost at the top. Now, Jimmy's manager kicked off. He didn't like that. He insisted Jimi Hendrix be the biggest artist on the bill. So Jimmy ended up negotiating a deal, his manager negotiated a deal where Jimmy was the most well-paid artist, and he was going to headline. He was going to go on last on the Sunday evening. So it would have cost you $18 to go and see 3 days of music, which is not bad. We've got Creedence Clearwater Revival there, the Grateful Dead, Joe Cocker, and of course Jimi Hendrix. Now, lots and lots of other bands were asked to come too. Bands like Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones actually turned it down, and they've always regretted the fact that they did, because it ended up being such an iconic performance. So Woodstock actually ends up being free. They sold 186,000 tickets. Okay, and that's a serious amount of tickets. That's a big, big festival. But the amount of people who actually showed up, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000. No one can say for sure, because no one's keeping count. No one expected that. And this puts Bethel, New York into total lockdown. If you're one of the unlucky residents who lives there, you can't go out. There's cars up and down the roads. You can't travel anywhere. You can't go to the shop to get some milk because everything has been bought. They can't get any new supplies in to stock the shops or the shelves because it's gridlocked. So there was about a 5-mile walk from abandoning your car to get to the actual festival in the end. And you can imagine the residents of Woodstock laughing about this and going, you know, we told you so. So yeah, they've been very glad it didn't happen in Woodstock, but it happened in the neighboring Bethel County. So Hendrix, due to headline the Sunday night, he doesn't actually get there until very, very late on Sunday. He almost misses his slot, if you like. There's kind of no time to go on. So you can see the picture there. That's what somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people look like at Woodstock. It's a huge, huge event. We talked about there not being enough food. Well, it's the same for the festival. They just weren't set up for that many people. On the plus side, they made the festival free. They couldn't really afford to police it to keep people out. So kind of for safety, they had to open the doors and say, okay, come in. But it's a serious shortage of toilets, of food stalls, of drink stalls, of clean water. So this brought the festival goers together in a sense. And there was a kind of lot of people looking out for each other. They set up hospital tents, food tents, water tents, and there was lots of trades and sharing kind of going on to try and make sure that everyone had enough to get by, or at least get through the festival. By the time Hendrix was due to go on, the festival had pretty much finished. He didn't actually go on stage till about 8 a.m. on the Monday morning. So the morning after he was scheduled to go on. But what he did is considered as one of his most iconic performances of all time. And we're going to have a look at that now. So Jimmy plays the Star Spangled Banner in his set. That's the American national anthem. Let's watch.
The funeral industry for more than a decade because the majority of people don't know this simple.
Okay, so Jimi Hendrix in his own rendition of the Star Spangled Banner, there, the American national anthem. So at this point, I'd like you to pause the video and have a go at answering the following questions for me. Okay, so whether you're a guitarist or not, I would like you to describe the tone of the guitar. Okay? This is the way it sounds. Is it distorted? Is it clean? What words would you use to describe how that guitar sounded? If you can, I'd like you to describe the techniques used on the guitar. So what's his left hand doing? What's his right hand doing? You know, any of the names for how he's playing it, the way he's playing it. And the last thing I'd like you to have a go at answering is, why do you think this performance is iconic? Why are people still talking about the way he played it to this day? So if you could pause it now, have a go at those 3 questions. Okay, assuming you've got answers to all 3, let's talk through each one in a little bit of detail. So the tone of his guitar is distorted, isn't it? So this means the signal is forced to a point where the speakers can't cope with it, and the sound begins to distort. So it's no longer clean, and you get that kind of crunchy, heavier sound. So if you put anything about the distortion or about being the crunch or high gain, anything like that, that would be absolutely correct. Now the techniques he's using on the guitar, okay, not all of you might be guitarists, but that's something we'll do at college. We'll look at each instrument in detail to give you a real idea and a sense of how the other instruments work and what it is they're doing, because I think that's going to make you a better musician. So the techniques he's doing there, there's quite a few on display. The most obvious is the use of the whammy bar, and you can see in the picture there, just by the bridge is Jimmy's whammy bar. Now his is obviously upside down. But you see him kind of grabbing that and pulling that throughout the performance. So what that does is that slackens off the strings, and then when you release it, they tighten again. So that gives him that kind of sound that he's making, and it sounds really kind of trippy, out of this world, psychedelic, which is absolutely what he's going for. But it's not normally something you'd get in the national anthem. On top of that, he's also doing a lot of hammer-ons and pull-offs. So this is where you take 1 fret on the guitar and you literally hammer it on. So there's another technique Hendrix has got going from there. Now the third question, why is this performance iconic to this day? Well, to understand that, you need a little bit of context, and again, that's something we'll be doing on the course. So 60s America historically is segregated. There's a lot of racial tensions. We have something called the Civil Rights Movement, led by Martin Luther King, to try and get equal rights for black people, get the right to vote, get the right to attend white schools, get the right to live in white areas. Now, thankfully, this was quite a progressive era for politics in that sense. And at the end of the decade, black people did have more rights, although it's still far from being equal. It's still far from being perfect, much like it is today. So the reason the performance is so iconic is partly because of Jimmy's skin color, because he's a black man getting up and playing the national anthem. Now, it's not just that, it's also to do with how he plays it. And normally when we do this, you get a lot of people go, well, he's playing it wrong. That's not right, that's not how it goes. And he's quite aware of that. So what he's adding there is massive amounts of dissonance into what otherwise would be quite a consonant, major, happy, triumphant sounding song. So in music, there are 2 terms used to describe intervals. We have consonant intervals, ones that sound at rest, and they sound quite pleasant. And then we have dissonant intervals, ones that clash, ones that want to move. And that's what Jimmy's using quite a lot of there in the national anthem. So that hadn't been done before. To take something so patriotic and chuck a load of dissonance into it and to play it entirely in your own way and how you felt was seen as iconic. And in a way, it almost became an alternative national anthem. You've got to remember the hippies, the people at the gigs, as well as the musicians, almost seen as counterculture. They're kind of outside of the mainstream. But actually what it's really saying is we are American. We are just as much a part of this country as you are. And yeah, our national anthem might be a little different, but we're still Americans at the end of the day. So it actually helps give these people kind of a sense of unity, if you like, just to reaffirm that they are American, they do count. And even though their national anthem is a little bit different, a little bit dissonant and weird, with lots of whammy bar and hammer-ons and distortion, it's still the national anthem nonetheless. Okay, so that video was taken around 5-6 months before Jimmy actually passes away. He dies of a drug overdose. But in his short career, he's managed to produce 3 studio albums, 3 live albums, 2 compilation albums, plus a load of singles. And this isn't including albums he did that he also played on as a sideman, not as the main feature. So he's left behind quite a legacy of music, which I'd really, really like you to get into. So if you are interested in learning more about Jimi Hendrix, there's a book you can check out on Amazon, which goes into detail, not just about Hendrix, but about the 27 Club itself. There's also the Woodstock documentary, which you can pick up on YouTube Movies for a couple of pounds just to rent it and watch it, which tells you more about that festival. And you can see performances, not just from Jimmy, but from all of the artists who played. And last but not least, I would definitely check out Spotify. So there is a podcast called The 27 Club, which delves into kind of each one of these artists in detail. But also, you've got Jimmy's entire back catalogue there kind of waiting for you. Okay, thank you so much for tuning in and playing along. I hope you learned something. What I'd like you to do now, please, is visit Kahoot and play Kahoot. So if you're not sure what that is, it's a website that lets you play online quizzes. Okay, so based on today's lessons, I've got some questions and videos set up that I'd like you to watch and have a go at answering to see what you've learned. It'll ask you for a code, and the code you need to put in is 020857880. Please use your real name because I'll have a look and see how you did. And hopefully I'll see you soon and we can pick this up again in the new college year. All right, take care. Bye-bye.